Like, hey, I'm gonna buy real estate in the US and they're gonna give me a green card.
Yes, but you got to be careful. Technically, that's not how it works. It's really two different transactions that you're executing in those kind of scenarios. You're
Hmm.
executing an agreement to buy the apartment and you're doing an EB-5 agreement. The developer sometimes will make it sound like it's one and the same. Like, here, you're buying this apartment and you're getting a green card on top of it. But it's technically doesn't work like that. And we don't have to go into all the legalities, but I would just say you cannot do that as one uniform or unified contract.
Hey guys, welcome back to another video. It's Aladdin from Visa Franchise. And I'm here with Charles Raether, immigration attorney, managing partner at AmLaw Group, and they're active here in South Florida. Charles, happy to have you on the show. Could you please introduce yourself a little bit so that our audience would know a little bit more about you? And then we dive straight into the EB-5 program.
Sounds good. Thanks, Aladdin. Thanks for having me today. As you mentioned, we practice here in South Florida, just outside Miami. Obviously, we have clients throughout the country and throughout the world. Maybe the majority are based in Florida or planning to move here, but of course, we've got people that are interested in relocating to just about any state in the U.S. We've been practicing for about 20 years, and I've been an attorney for maybe about 30 years, but we focus on business immigration. So what that means is we focus on EB-5, but in addition to that, a whole number of other business-related visas, I'm sure many of which you're very familiar with as well, E2, L1, talent-based visas, O1s, EB-1As, and stuff like that. We don't deal too much with political asylum, stuff like that, but we work with entrepreneurs, high net worth individuals, and talented professionals, and helping them, make their best transition to the U.S.
Sounds great. Charles, today we wanted to take a deeper dive into this very, very popular program called EB-5. So I'd like to pick your brain here a little bit. Could you first of all elaborate a little bit about how the EB-5 program came about? What is it that USCIS wants to see? And how does US benefit from it?
I'm not always sure USCIS knows what it wants from the EB-5 program. It's kind of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type situation. I mean, it's a love-hate relationship, I think, between immigration, the Immigration Service, and EB-5. I think the EB-5 program is a great program, and you guys are involved with it, and a lot of people are aware of it, and it's becoming more and more popular, especially over the last few years since the new law came out in late 2022. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in the future, a little bit later today. But as to the origins of the program and how long it's been around, I mean, it was created, I think, back in the early 1990s, quite honestly. And so, but it really was dormant. I mean, nobody was really that involved with EB-5 in the 90s and even the early 2000s. And then at one point, they passed a law. It was a pilot program that kept getting renewed every couple of years that created the regional centers. And
Right.
when they created that, that's what really piqued the interest and the activity. And it didn't really take off at first, but when it really took off was after the subprime mortgage crisis in the US in 2008, 2009, when, if you were here back then, real estate, all development just froze up because the banks weren't lending. I mean, we literally had a financial meltdown in the US. And so you had all these developers and other parties that couldn't get financing from typical lending sources from banks and stuff like that because everybody was just kind of recovering from the crisis. And that's really when the renaissance of EB-5 took off. So this was right after 2008, 2009, that you had some entrepreneurial regional centers saying, hey, guys, we can kind of take the place of banks. We can help develop funding, recruit investors from overseas to help do these projects. And so that's really when things got started for the program as we now know it. So starting like 2010 or so, it was a little bit kind of the Wild West back then. I mean, you had a lot of new players entering the field who didn't maybe have much experience. So you had to be careful. There were cases
Right. We
of,
heard in a lot of horror stories, by the way.
yeah. And people ask about it. And it was a bit like the Wild West. I mean, we started doing
Right.
EB-5 in maybe 2011, 2012. And yeah, you're right. There were some horror stories. I hate to say that, but you use the term. So, I'll repeat it. But it's changed a lot, Aladdin, since then. The industry has gotten much more sophisticated, I would say, and more consolidated. So there's fewer regional centers running around right now working with developers than there were, say, maybe 10 years ago. And even though I'm a big proponent of competition, and generally competition helps further progress, in the case of EB-5, I think it's been beneficial because it's gotten rid of a lot of those players who weren't serious, who probably shouldn't have been involved in this anyway. And they just
Right.
fell by the wayside. And the people in the regional centers and other players that are remaining are, experienced. They've been around a long time. They've kind of weathered the ups and downs, and they have a very good reputation that they value in terms of going forward.
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with you. I mean, we heard some of those stories, and we joined to. I mean, I joined one of the major EB-5 events that took place here in Miami.
Uh-huh.
It was, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and everybody was talking about the regulations and how the EB-5 program really has gotten a facelift, and how the future looks bright for the program, both for brokers and for regional centers, and also for attorneys in the program. Taking a step back and looking at it from an immigrant's perspective, or from an investor's perspective, there's there's a lot of things that needs explanation and differentiation, to be honest with you. So as you rightfully said, the program started back in the 90s, and it was a little dormant, and back in those days it was like 500K,
Yep.
but today that amount has changed. That amount has changed to 800K, and a million five, and everybody's like, hold on, is it 800K, is it a million, what is happening? But then there are different categories, and there are different ways of doing it, right?
Correct.
So take me as somebody who doesn't know anything about it, and I'm hearing certain different figures: $1 million, 800K. I just want to invest money in the US, and get green card for me and for my family. How much am I looking at, considering that it's going to be a passive investment?
Yeah, there's a lot of information floating out there, and there are a lot of misnomers about what the program entails. You're correct. The minimum investment amount now is 800,000. It was at 500 for a long time. It briefly went up to 900, came back to 500 for a little while, and we had a couple investors that were able to jump on that wave when it came back to 5, and then it went up back to 8. So it's currently at 800,000. That's the minimum amount. The other amount you're talking about is 1,050,000. The difference is, and sometimes there's a misnomer. Some people think that if you're investing in a regional center, it's 800,000, and if you're investing in a direct business, your own business, it's 1,050,000. That's not the case. It doesn't matter whether a regional center is involved in the project or not. That does not affect the amount you have to invest. What does affect what amount you have to invest is where the project is located. So
Hmm.
the default amount is theoretically 1,050,000. So that's kind of the standard. But if you invest in one of two areas, then you qualify for the lower amount, which is 800,000. And those two areas are if A, the project is located in a rural area, and they define rural as meaning it's in a census tract that has less than 25,000 people. And the other option is if it's in a high unemployment area. And in that case, if the project's in a high unemployment area, you also qualify if you invest only 800,000. Now, people say, "Oh, well, I'm investing in, the projects in, I don't know, Orlando, Detroit, something like that." Or especially sometimes they'll make comments like if it's a maybe depressed city, they might say Detroit, or I don't know, Chicago or something. People have to understand it's not based on the city; it's literally based on the census tract, which is oftentimes smaller than a zip code. So you very often have cases where your project might be on this side of the street. You just cross the street, it's in a different zone, and it might be high unemployment there or low unemployment. So you literally have to look at the specific address to determine whether it's in a high unemployment zone or a rural area. So that's the main consideration. I think in reality,
Right.
Aladdin, most investors that we work with, they prefer the 800,000. So there's very few projects out there that are offering 1,050,000 because it's just not very palatable or interesting for investors out there. I think most cases where you might see somebody investing maybe 1,050,000 is if it is a direct investment. It's their own business, and that business just happens to be located, in an area where you have to invest 1 million, and they're planning maybe to invest that much anyway. So it's maybe not that big of a deal for them in that case.
Sure. Well, I mean, thanks for elaborating that, Charles. So yeah, we got that, but now the thing that we're investing in is called a regional center. Okay, what is a regional center? Again, coming from outside the states, the resonance of that word regional center is like, what am I investing in? Am I investing in
Yeah,
a community center? Is it a hospital? Is it
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
youth center or something, or is it a real estate project?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a little misleading what a regional center is. So, a regional center is a company, it's a private entity that received a license from the Immigration Service to sponsor investment projects such that investors in that project could then qualify for a green card based on the money they put into this project. So, in a way, it's almost like a franchise, if you want to call it. It's almost like a brand. Somebody might have a restaurant and they want to make that restaurant a McDonald's, so they execute an agreement with with McDonald's to have a license to then work under that brand. So, like I said, if you could do a direct investment, and maybe we'll talk a little bit later what that's about, but the
Sure.
vast majority of people, probably 96% of all investors, go into a regional center project. Now, you're not technically investing the money in the regional center. The regional center is basically the entity that provides the structure and the legal basis for getting the green card. The money is technically going into the development, the project itself. So how it works is developers will execute an agreement with a regional center. Usually it works the other way. Usually the regional centers go out and look for good projects in their area. So a regional center has a license only in a specific geographic area. And that geographic area generally cannot cross state lines. And usually it's given for a particular kind of metro area. So there's regional centers, say, lots in Florida, for example, lots in California, but generally they don't cover the whole state. They only cover certain metro areas. So somebody might have a regional center and it covers, Southeast Florida. In most cases, it's not going to cover Northern Florida. So the regional center looks for promising deals that are promising projects that are in its geographic scope. And they'll find a good deal. They say they'll need an investor, or sorry, a developer. They like the project. They might know the developer already. Maybe they had a previous history with them. And they'll execute an agreement such that the regional center will sponsor. And by sponsor, I don't mean they're putting money into it. By sponsor, we mean they execute an affiliation agreement whereby, yeah, the regional centers, yeah, we'll work with you guys on this project. And, that will allow investors in your project to get a green card. The structure, how it works, is usually what happens is a separate, it's called a special purpose vehicle, an SPV, gets formed. And so you have the developer here, you have the regional center, and then you have the investors here. The regional center will generally create another entity, this SPV, usually a partnership or an LLC, and then the EB-5 investors will put their money into this SPV, and then the money goes from that SPV to the developer. The regional center generally, I mean, it depends on the structure, but usually the regional center is that entity that controls that SPV, and they just, they monitor it. They make sure, okay, investor XYZ put their money in. They execute an agreement with the developer as to when the money will go into the project. Like some developers say, hey, we only need 10 million this quarter, but next quarter we're going to need another 20 million. And so it's the regional center that kind of monitors the cash flows and the movement of the funds and make
Right.
sure that everything's okay for the investors and the developers.
Regional center is the group of people or the company that puts together the structure to enable that project to receive funds from foreign investors, so that the foreign investors can get their green cards and the project can get extra funding. That's
Right.
basically what the regional center does. Regional center, however, is not necessarily the project itself. There is a developer that is developing the project. Am I correct in my?
You're correct. Although there are some developers that have their own regional center. And I'm not saying necessarily that's a bad thing, but you have to understand there's a potential for conflict of interest, right?
Right.
Because the developer is getting the money. The developer
Mhm.
also manages the regional center, and the regional center is supposed to be the guy that kind of makes sure everybody's playing above the table and playing, following what they're supposed to be doing and stuff like that. So I'm
Right.
not saying it's a very dangerous situation, but there could be a conflict of interest. So from an investor's perspective, it's usually safer if the regional center is completely independent from the developer, because that just makes sure you've got somebody looking out for the investor's interests if something comes up.
I mean, from my perspective, I've been working in the investor migration industry for pretty long time now.
Hmm.
And my experience and my expertise has been in the CBI, citizenship by investment,
Yep.
especially for real estate. It was when we used to do it back in Turkey. It was a very straightforward process where you buy a piece of real estate for $400,000
Hmm.
and you own the property. It's your property, and you get a citizenship with it, right? But coming over here to the US, I'm like, okay, so I'm investing in a real estate project. Am I owning the real estate, or will I ever own the real estate at some point?
That's a good question, Aladdin. And it's
Yeah.
actually, yes, the US program differs a lot from a lot of these CBI programs in Turkey and other jurisdictions. Honestly, I wish they would do it like they did maybe in Turkey and other places where, you buy real estate. At least I would like it from the perspective of, I think it would generate a lot more interest maybe because people, especially from certain markets, like we work with a lot of people from Eastern Europe, Russia, they feel more comfortable with real estate, right? They feel like, okay, even if worse comes to worse, everything falls apart. At least I still got this apartment or this real estate that belongs to
Right.
me, and that gives them a level of comfort. Unfortunately, that's not how it works with the EB-5 program. Now, you will see, and you maybe have run across these too. There are sometimes some developers, even especially in Miami here, and currently there's a couple projects where they try to convey that idea to the investors. They try to say, "Hey, look, this is kind of like in Turkey. We're building, a condos. We're building a building of apartments or condos or something, and
Right.
you
In a
can buy
nice
it."
area, looking nice and all that.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like, hey, I'm going to buy real estate in the US and they're going to give me a green card.
yes. And the thing is, I'm not going to say anything bad about it, but you got to be careful. Technically, that's not how it works. I mean, the developer might promote it that way, but that's more of a marketing. I don't want to say a trick, but it's a marketing catch to get people interested. The reality is, and I'm not saying you're not buying an apartment. I mean, I'm not saying they're tricking you in that regards. You are buying an apartment, but it's not so much that you're, it's really two different transactions that you're executing in those kind of scenarios. You're
Hmm.
executing an agreement to buy the apartment and you're doing an EB-5 agreement. The developers sometimes will make it sound like it's one and the same. Like, here, you're buying this apartment and you're getting a green card on top of it. But it's technically doesn't work like that. And we don't have to go into all the legalities, but I would just say you cannot do that as one uniform or unified contract. USCIS has clearly said, and there were scandalous projects kind of 10, 15 years ago where people would do that. They said, here, we will sell you, you'll invest 500,000, we'll sell you 1 or 2 units, you'll get ownership to those units, and at the end, instead of getting your money back, you just take title to the units. And USCIS explicitly came out and said, you can't do this. This is not okay according to the rules and the law and stuff like that.
So,
So yeah,
so,
go
so,
ahead.
what are some of the potential risks we're looking at, Charles? Especially here in Miami, these projects are marketed heavily, and for from a foreigner's perspective, of course, they don't. I mean, it's hard for any non-attorney or non-regional center to understand the dynamics and how EB-5
Yeah,
works.
yeah, yeah.
And it's, think about it, you're a foreign investor. Who are you working with? You're working with either a migration agent, or you're working with a company based here in the US, or
Uh-huh.
working with a regional center. You're not necessarily as well versed about the laws and regulations. And for you, okay, I'm buying an apartment and I'm getting, okay, so you've executed the payment and you did those two agreements that you talked about. What are some of the potential risks that those people would encounter in short to medium term?
Sure. So if we just talk about the risk of this subset of deals where they're selling you an apartment or something. So we're just talking about that. We're not talking about most projects which are really different, which don't involve real estate. And we can talk about that in a second. But if we're talking
Right.
about specifically a deal you're saying where, hey, they're selling you an apartment and they're saying, hey, on top of that, you can get the green card. What are the risks? And I can speak from experience because we've had clients that have been in these projects. The biggest risk I would say, and again, it's not the end of the world, but it's a financial strain for clients when they weren't expecting this. Here's what the biggest risk could be. Let's say the apartment costs $1 million. Usually what the developer will say is they'll say, okay, it costs $1 million. You put in 800,000 right now. And let's say the closing on the apartment is going to be in 2 years. And at the time of the closing, we will just set off the 800 you already contributed towards purchasing the apartment, right? So the idea is,
Right.
okay, when it closes in 2 years, you only have to put in another 200,000. Well, what's the risk in this? I'll admit the risk of this happening is slightly lesser now than it was 5 years ago, because when we had COVID, it was causing lots of delays, but with the processing of the EB-5 visas. But here's what the risk is. The risk is you're 2 years down the road. The developer says, okay, the apartment's ready. You have to take title. You have to provide the rest of the money. But let's say your EB-5 petition has not been reviewed yet. You haven't even gotten the first green card. You can't take your money out of the investment. And when you're taking title to it, technically what you're doing is you're taking the money out of the developer and it's kind of going over to you, because right, you're buying this apartment. This is now your property.
Right.
And so the money is no longer at risk. And that's a violation of the EB-5. So what happens in cases like this is they might come to you and say, okay, we have to close on the apartment. The investor is thinking, okay, I got to just put in another 200. But no, the developer says, no, because your EB-5 was delayed or you haven't gotten your first green card yet, you've got to put in another 800,000 because we can't touch that money yet because you're not allowed to take it out of the project. And so that's the biggest risk, I would say, with these kind of things. You could get stuck with having to pay twice. Then you close on the apartment. And then maybe later, 2-3 years later, when you do get the green card and you're allowed to take out your EB-5 money, then you can get the 800,000 out. But there's going to be a period of time when you're going to have to invest maybe 1,800,000, right? Instead of just that million we talked about, if that's clear. So that's the biggest risk.
Yeah.
Again, it's not the end of the world. You still get your green card, you get your apartment, but you might have to freeze up a lot more money than you were anticipating.
Sure. Well, Charles, I'll ask you one more question regarding that, and then we're going to switch to a different part of EB-5,
Okay.
which is through business. But say I invested in a regional center. I invest 800K. Is there a guarantee that I'm going to get my money back? Because what they promised me, hey, we're going to pay you X amount of interest per annum. And usually it's a very, very, very low amount of interest, something like 1% or 1.5% if you're lucky. But afterwards, you're going to get your money back. But do I have a guarantee that I will get my money back? Is that guarantee recognized by USCIS or another government body that would enforce that? Or is it just a contract between me and the developer? If the money is gone, the money is gone.
Yeah.
But you get your green card.
Well, yeah. So this is where the EB-5 project maybe differs from other CBI ones. Is by law there cannot be a guarantee. They cannot guarantee anything. Now in the sales process, they might say, hey, don't worry, we're guaranteeing. They might give you all this sales fluff. But yeah, literally, if you read the contract, if it's written in accordance with the EB-5 law, they cannot guarantee. Now that doesn't mean you're totally at risk. You're flying out there in the wind and nobody, no, that's not the case. It just means they can't guarantee, usually the EB-5 investment period is maybe 5 years. That's a standard. There can't be a guarantee in the sense of, okay, we promise come hell or high water, after 5 years, we're going to give you this money back. I mean, there could be a contractual arrangement that says, yes, our plan is to do this and pay you at this point. And there could be consequences if they don't meet those objectives, like the interest rate could increase. And that happens sometimes. They'll say, here, we'll pay you 1% for the first 5 years. If we don't pay you back after year 5, the interest rate might go to 2 or 3 or 5%. Or the investors might be able to take over the project. Or they could put a lien on the cash flow. It all depends on the project and what kind of investor protections are in there. But any good project that's a normal project, that's with a decent regional center, they're going to have these protections in place to protect the investors in the event that the developer is not able to follow through on his contractual obligations.
Right.
But the answer is, you hit it on the head, Aladdin, that it's a contractual agreement, and there could be penalties, right, if the developer doesn't meet those obligations. But yeah, there's no guarantee. You can't go to the government and say, hey, these guys, didn't pay me on time.
Where's my money? You can't say that.
Yeah, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they're not going to help you with that, unfortunately.
Yeah. No negotiation with the Uncle Sam. If they say your money must be at risk, then your money must be at risk.
Yeah, yeah.
And
it doesn't mean high risk. It just means it's got to be at risk. And,
sure.
If it's a good regional center, and there's good ones out there, they will have in place very good protections for the investors so that, if there's a delay or stuff like that, that you're protected. Now, again, there can be delays, and you should be prepared for that. But again, as long as there's clear milestones and clear protections and clear incentives for the developer to then settle up with the EB-5 investors, it should be okay.
Cool. Well, thank you for that, Charles. Now let's talk about another way. And this is let me give you a bit of a background of why I want to ask this question and move into this direction. Because most often than not, we get people, especially from Indian origin or Chinese origin, they're subject to this big backlog of green card, and they want a shorter way, and they've been successful in their lives here in the US, and they were able to save up some money, or they borrow some more from their family members and put together some 800K, or sometimes $1 million. They're really not investors. They're looking for an expedited way to
Hmm.
get a green card that get ahead of that backlog.
Yeah.
Now, in that case, some people say, okay, shall I open up a business, hire 10 people, invest about $1 million? Would I get a green card that way? Or, what are some of the ways that I can get a green card through EB-5 doing what I'm professionally trained for? So how would you look at, EB-5 applications that way? And what would sort of like be your advice to those people who are in that kind of situation where they don't necessarily have $800,000 to risk on a regional center, yet they need an expedited way to get a green card?
Yeah. Well, you're totally right about the expedited way. I mean, that's part of the EB-5 renaissance in the last couple of years since they changed the law. The big influx again of Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese as well investors because they can skip the line basically that existed before or for other categories. Now, if we're talking about a case where the client, first of all, doesn't have that 800,000 himself or herself, like you said, it's very common to maybe get either a gift or a loan from parents, close friends. You could even do it from a bank or a financial institution, either in the U.S. or your home country. There are even some regional centers that are financing uh, investors as well. Like they want the investors to at least put up 50% of the money, but you can finance with the regional center. So it's not the regional center directly, it's an affiliated entity that they have that are lending out these funds. But I think that's a very interesting innovation. I mean, you did not have that 10 years ago, right? There were
Right.
not regional centers out there financing this. But I think it's a great idea because, right, people might, they might have 400,000, but not everybody's got 800,000 lying around. And if you can, again, there's sources of finance. I think it's a great opportunity for people. But to answer your question, if I understood it correctly, is what about these people that want to continue their professional activities and maybe do a direct business here in the U.S. related
Right.
to what they're doing? I would say, from my experience, that's a somewhat risky proposition. I'm not saying it's doesn't work, but you've got to understand the EB-5 world is not the business world. Meaning the requirements of the program are really crazy sometimes. I mean, it's sometimes defies, I wouldn't say defies common sense, but it challenges common sense, like why the government has these certain rules and regulations. So something you would do purely from a business perspective might create problems with the EB-5 side. And so people kind of run into that when they have their own business and they're doing that for EB-5 purposes. Again, I'm not saying it's crazy stuff, but there's certain requirements you have to do when you hire the people, how long they got to be working, where the location is if they're working, are they working remotely, not remotely. These generally are resolvable issues, but it can be a headache. It's a bit of a headache ensuring compliance. And so from that perspective, when you go with a regional center, they take all those burdens on themselves, right? I mean, first of all, they're experienced in this. They've been doing this for years, and
Right.
they know exactly what the requirements and how you do it, and they make sure you check all the boxes that are required. We do work with clients who do direct investments as well in their own businesses. For our practice as well as general, overall statistics, I mean, it's maybe but like 3-4% of all investors do it that way. And I think there's a reason, just because it's a real pain in the back end to do all this. And so, there's a flip side to this, right? You're going to get much more, assuming, you run your business well, you're going to get more than a 1% return on that investment.
Sure.
So, if you feel confident in your business, here's what I would say. In what cases do I think maybe a direct investment makes sense for a client? If they've got a partner here in the US that they're going to be working with, because you imagine it, right? You're coming from a foreign country. Even if you visited the US for many years, it's one thing to visit, it's another thing to run a
No, maybe
business.
maybe you're already here, on a different visa,
True. Yeah, yeah,
right?
that's true too. Yeah, H-1B maybe, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, if you've been here, yes. So getting back maybe what an ideal client is for this scenario that you're proposing. Maybe you've lived here for a long time in some other status, H-1B, something else, and you've got a good business here. You've got a good handle on how to do things, and you feel yes, you could easily launch this EB-5 business. Maybe you've got another business with a partner, but you want to split off from him, create your own company, but you're going to take the clients with you or whatever the production you're doing. It would be pretty straightforward. Yes, in that kind of scenario, I would agree. It might make sense to do a direct investment. Um, you will pay more in a direct investment for the legal fees and other stuff, but at the end of the day, you're probably saving money as opposed to going to the route of the regional center because theoretically you're going to be making more money. And so your upfront costs are going to be a little bit more because you've got to, when we're doing a direct investment, we have to prepare the business plan ourselves. We got to do the operating agreements, other documents. That's work that the regional center will do. But in the long run, again, if you feel positive about the long-term prospects of your business, yeah, you're going to probably come out better in the long run. The two things I maybe should just mention, Aladdin, about when you're doing a direct investment, but this is true for any kind of business, whether it's a regional center or a direct business, there's two main criteria. You're investing the minimum amount of money and you're hiring 10 employees per investor. That 10 employees is usually what gets most clients. I mean, we have a lot of clients, they could invest $1 million in a business, but when you tell them, okay, you're going to have to hire 10 people, W-2 employees, not subcontractors, not 1099, but W-2
Yeah, then it gets
employees.
expensive.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't have a
And
need
your
for those 10
business may or
people,
may not need those employees.
correct. Yeah, yeah.
So you're taking on a burden just to qualify for E2. It may not, sorry, EB-5,
Mm-hmm.
and it may not make business sense at the moment. And I guess to complement your point, you would only do that if it makes sense. So, for example, you're already going to invest, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 million dollars, or you're going to employ minimum 10, 15 people anyway, and it's a bigger operation, then you're saying, yeah, then absolutely would definitely make sense.
Sure.
But you don't venture, let's say you were able to raise $1 million, out of your own savings,
Mm-hmm.
from family and friends and gifts and loans and whatever not. And that's the only thing you have. And you go into a business just to get the EB-5. You're saying it could be a little bit of a, dangerous territory, because the business may or may not need those implications that would be imposed by the EB-5 program. You
Mm-hmm.
would then be better off just going for a regional center. I get
Correct.
that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Now, just to tap it off, let's talk about the franchise route, which happens to be our bread and butter,
You bet.
right? We usually work with investors who prefer the E2 visa. They would come and buy a franchise and invest usually around 150, 200K, or even sometimes $300,000. Buy a franchise, build it, get the E2 visa, and then follow a different, green card path. But sometimes we do have investors, and they have much bigger budgets, and they want to buy a business, or open up a franchise, invest $1 million or more, and apply for the EB-5 program that way. Now, right there, I have two questions. First of all, does that work? Again, I think you would say that it would work. Second of all, what I'm going to say is that, say we bought the franchise at a much lower amount, but we worked the business and we reinvested profits back into the business, and now it's over, say, 1.5 to $2 million, and I already have more than 10 people working for me
Mm-hmm.
4 years down the line. Do I still qualify for the EB-5?
Yeah. Yes, you would. The short answer is yes, you would. Ironically, as you described it, it sounds like a very or possibly enticing option for people. From my experience, though, there's very few people that have gone that route where they start with the E2 with a smaller amount. They invest maybe 200,000, and they build it up, hire more people, subsequently invest more money, and then later qualify for the EB-5 and then transfer over. I mean, yes, you're absolutely correct in how that works. But for whatever reason, at least from our experience, and maybe that's just some of the clients we work with, we maybe one or two people only over the years has gone down that route. I'm not sure why that is, but But
I think I have an idea because India and China are the countries that are subject to the backlog, and they do not have E2 treaties.
that's
So if
true.
you were to
Yeah,
have a lot of Indians doing E2s, maybe then they would convert them to
I
EB-5
suppose. Yeah, yeah,
later down the road.
yeah.
But people, other nationalities, they would find, much faster options such as EB2 NIW or even EB1A in some cases.
Yep, yep, absolutely. Assuming they're talented, right, and meet the requirements for the EB1A or
Sure.
NIW. But yes, you're totally right. The one important factor I would just emphasize here. So as you described it, it's correct. The main thing to keep in mind then is, let's say you invest 200K, you don't have 800K at the time you started the E2 business, but over time you're generating more revenue from the business, et cetera. What's critical is you've got to take the money out of the E2 business, as dividends, pay taxes on it.
Pay taxes on them
Yeah,
and
and then
reinvest.
reinvest it back into the company. And at that point, that additional money you're putting back in, that gets counted for purposes of the EB-5. And once you hit that threshold, like say of 800,000,
So the cost of that to you is actually way more than $1 million, including the taxes you pay.
I guess, yeah, if you count the taxes, yeah,
Yeah, take it out and put it back in.
correct.
Okay, that's certainly doable.
One
Well,
other thing too, maybe just to mention before we change topics related to the
sure.
direct business is under the new law, though, you can only have one EB-5 investor in a direct business scenario. So in the past, you might have two partners, maybe it's two brothers, and they want to open up a restaurant and do an EB-5, and they would do that in the past. We'd have clients like that, or E2, like you said. But again, if the project's not being sponsored by a regional center, then you can only have one investor in that business, EB-5 investor at least.
Cool. Well, Charles, this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you very much. I was able to ask some of these off-the-cuff questions, which I believe that our audience would want to know. Obviously, the EB-5 process is far more detailed and intricate that our general questions here. And I would definitely have you one more time on the channel to dive deeper into regional centers and how to navigate that and all the other steps and everything. But for today, I thought, we had a pretty good discussion. Are there any, closing words, maybe a piece of advice to the audience, especially our audience who are generally professionals or entrepreneurs who are not necessarily investors, but they would want to get the green card, the fastest way
Right.
possible?
I think, it's hard to make generalizations because everybody has a unique situation and scenario. But I would say one thing, taking into account your audience, your target audience that are generally professionals, not necessarily investors, entrepreneurs who want to start up the next, new Tesla here or something. I would say, yes, EB-5 is a very good opportunity. And from my experience, I think generally what works best for people, such as, the audience, for this channel, is probably doing an investment in a regional center, because you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Because if you create a business where you're professionally, want to continue your professional activities and also use that business for the EB-5, God forbid something happens with that business, doesn't work out. It's one thing, people start, crash and burn all the time in the startup world, right? And, it's maybe not the end of the world, but when your immigration status is dependent on that, I'm not so sure you want to use, software startup as a basis for, developing your wealth in your business and also the basis for your green card. So I think generally it's safer to diversify your risk, invest in a regional center project. Okay, you're not going to make the type of returns you would in your own business, but then use what remaining funds you have. If you want to start up your own business, use that to start up a business. Or if you've got, a salaried position here or something like that, you've got that. So you've got that comfort of, having some income, or whether it's your own business or working somewhere. And at the same time, separate from that, you've got the basis for the green card, so that if the business doesn't work out, you're not going to have to pack up your bags tomorrow and take your family out of the country.
That's a great advice, Charles. Thank you very much for doing that.
Sure, absolutely.
But I really love the conversation. I'd like to continue this in another setting, maybe another video, if we can have some more of your time. So that'd be great. And again, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you were able to make it this far, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and also turn out the notification bell. And also leave your comments down below asking certain questions for me to ask Charles the next time that we meet. Charles, thank you very much.
Thanks, Aladdin. Pleasure being here with you.